We're going live. Yep, yep, yep. No, no, wait, wait, wait. Stand by, stand by. Okay. I'm taking mine off. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Tim Cowart, Jr. I am the president of Claude Govan, chapter Tuskegee Airmen, Inc. Welcome to the American Air Power Museum. Today, Sunday, May 30th, 2 o'clock and change. Um, all I can tell you is that we have a nice presentation for you. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Renard Burns, who is our Public Relations Officer. Mr. Burns?
They were involved in the struggle overseas and in the United States. Because of their struggle and their perseverance, much changed in the American military. We have with us the children and relatives of Tuskegee Airmen. Unfortunately, many of those wonderful men have long passed away. Some have passed away as recently as January, including Mr. Johnson, who has been playing in a loop prior to us starting. We have joining us today, on my extreme left, Judge Mark Whiten. His father was a pilot of the 477th. He piloted a B-25, a twin-engine bomber. His uncle was a pilot of a P-51. Next to him is Dr. Darlene DeFore. Her father was Wilfred DeFore, a Tuskegee Airman who served at Ramitelli Air Force Base, Air Base in Italy from 1943 to 1945. Next to Dr. DeFore is Pat Terrelong. Her father was also a Tuskegee Airman. Next to Pat is Amelia Montgomery. Her husband was a Tuskegee Airman who served at Ramitelli in Italy from 1943 to 1945. He also, coincidentally, happened to be one of Martin Luther King's bodyguards during the Selma March. So the history of the Tuskegee Airmen extends beyond World War II and their contributions to this country. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history about why their struggle was so important. And this started in 1925, excuse me, with the Army War College coming out with a statement that blacks were incapable of flying aircraft. They didn't have the coordination, the courage, and the aptitude to fly, maintain, or do anything else that had to do with flying. They thought that they were, in essence, subhuman people. This permeated and continued throughout the military perception of blacks well into World War II, which was one of the main challenges to the Tuskegee Airmen fighting for their right to fly and join the ranks of the military to fight the Axis powers. In 1938, the civilian pilot training program was started to try and acquire more pilots in preparation for possible use if the war expanded to the United States. This opened the door for blacks to start to be trained. One of the colleges that was selected was Tuskegee. During 1938, Charles Anderson, a private pilot, a black private pilot, became one of the instructors at Tuskegee. He would later become the pilot who flew Eleanor Roosevelt in that historic flight that helped create the Tuskegee Airmen and their support for that particular 99th Fighter Squadron. In 1940, the draft law, Franklin Roosevelt instituted the draft law, which is the first peacetime draft law, and it opened the doors for anyone, regardless of color, regardless of sex, regardless of anything else, would be able to serve in the military. In 1941, Tuskegee was selected as the training facility for black pilots, based mainly upon its support and record for supporting aeronautics, also for its weather conditions, would be able to train for a good part of the year. And the program was really started, got its bump from Eleanor Roosevelt. As I said earlier, Charles Anderson, an instructor at Tuskegee, flew Eleanor Roosevelt on a test flight around, much to the disagreement of her security team. She wanted a picture to be taken back to Washington to say, yes, these men can fly, and they can fly very well. Eleanor Roosevelt is responsible for an awful lot of things that happened, particularly with the Tuskegee Airmen. She brought supporters and fundraising personnel to Tuskegee to help build and finish building the airports, the airfields that the Tuskegee Airmen would later use in their training. The Tuskegee Airmen had their first 5 graduates in 1942. One of those first five was Benjamin O. Davis. Benjamin O. Davis later became the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen. And as another important thing, Benjamin O. Davis was a graduate of West Point. During his time at West Point, he was shunned, he wasn't spoken to, he basically spent his time at West Point in isolation unless it was during class time. He ate by himself, he slept alone, and he had no interaction with anyone else at West Point. And he persevered, graduated with honors, and later became a 4-star general. 1943 was the first time the Tuskegee Airmen met combat, and they went to Tunisia and later supported the troops in Anzio, usually flying P-40 Warhawks. They did perform very well in these aircraft, but they were only limited to ground support. Eventually they wound up in Italy and were given the P-51, which was the Cadillac of fighter planes during World War II. It had a superior fighting, speed, agility, and they learned how to use them very well. They became support flyers for the 15th Air Force. And as their record with the 15th Air Force, they lost fewer or none of their B-17s in combat. Each one of the B-17s had a crew of 10. Prior to the Tuskegee Airmen taking over their support and guard, many of these planes were lost on each mission. So we're talking if 10 planes were lost, 100 flyers went down. When they took over, their main job was, and they were ordered, you do not leave the bombers. You stay with them no matter what happens. If you are attacked, you can fight them off, but you never leave the formation. They held true to that mission and were awarded many medals for their courage and their perseverance. We have one of the main missions that is talked about a lot, but something behind it was a mission to Berlin, in which the Tuskegee Airmen were asked to escort a flight of B-17s into Berlin to bomb, I believe it was the Benz factory. They were supposed to be relieved by another fighter squadron. That other squadron never appeared, so they made a decision to continue the flight. In preparation for this, they came up with some tanks, the fuel tanks that were necessary to fly this. I'm going to ask Mrs. Montgomery if she would give us a little bit of an explanation about these fuel tanks.
Certainly. The fuel tanks that the airmen had on their planes were only 65 gallons of fuel. In order to complete a mission, which they were not authorized to do as yet, to go to Germany, they needed a tank that was 110 gallons. So that would not have allowed them to go farther if they had to complete that mission. The colonel had given them, told them that they were to go only so far with the bombers. But the captain was given the authority that if they had to go beyond the point that they were supposed to leave the bombers, to go ahead. Well, in order to do that, they had to have that 110-gallon tank called drop tanks. So what the airmen did, they, at one night, very late at night, I think it was after midnight, They went over to the train station to unofficially acquire these fuel tanks. And it was not official. Well, let's just say they were not dishonest, but they were dishonest, okay? So they went over and they drove the trucks across the train tracks so that the train would not proceed without them acquiring these tanks. They acquired 225 tanks, loaded them on the trucks, went back to the base, and I understand it was several miles away, went back to the base, and they had so many hours to attach these tanks onto the planes in order to perform their mission that morning. They did it. I don't know how many men were involved, but I understand that my husband was one of them. I didn't know it until after he passed away, but that's okay. And I wondered why, but they said it was still a felony, so he was a felon. But he was an honest felon, okay? So they did the attachments of the tanks to the planes, and the airmen, the pilots were able to proceed ahead. The captain gave them the order. When they saw that the bombers had not met them at the point they were supposed to meet them, the captain gave them the order to go ahead. And Benjamin O. Davis complimented him when they got back and said that that was the right thing to do. And that's when the airmen went over and bombed everything up, bombed up the trains, the planes, the boats, whatever they could bomb, they did. And that's how they were able to win this war.
I could just add one thing. What's so important about understanding the approach that the Tuskegee Airmen took in close support was that prior to the airmen being involved in close support of the bombers, the American forces were taking 60% losses every time their bombers would go out. Send 10 bombers out, 4 would come back. Each of those bombers had a crew of 6. So that means they were losing 60% of the men who went out and flew those planes. So thanks to the approach of close order support that the airmen had, a lot of men came home to their families who wouldn't have ordinarily or otherwise done that. And I'll just note, I think that Dr. Darlene DeFore will also note that her father was also
part of that mission.
on the big heist.
Yeah.
And when we would have Mr. DeFore at meetings, before he passed away about 2 years ago, we would say, Mr. DeFore, so you were involved in that. And he always had this chuckle. He didn't want to talk about it too much because I really think they were worried about a felony after the statute of limitations. But that's why going into Berlin, if those bombers had made that run without the support of the airmen, would any of them have come back? Would the mission have worked?
Yeah.
Would America have failed at its first attempt to bomb Berlin? Maybe.
Yeah.
So that's what's so important.
Yeah, one of the things I was also told, because we all told slightly different things about the mission, was that they had requisitioned this fuel. The fuel, but they were told that they had to wait 3 days. But there was this other supply that was coming in. And they said, we can't wait 3 days. So as a result of that, we have to think of some other means to acquire what we need in order to successfully complete this mission. Yeah, and so that's when they decided that, okay, we have to stop the train and acquire
Unofficially
the
acquired.
needed fuel.
You
Was
notice
your
these-
dad a part of we have pictures of them with wood blocks trying to make these tanks fit on these planes because they weren't for our planes.
Yeah, they weren't for, but they had to retrofit.
And your dad was part of
Yeah.
that. And the painting the tails red.
Yeah.
We only feel comfortable telling these stories now because unfortunately these men are gone.
Yeah.
There can be no legal repercussion against them, but we certainly should note their heroism, their ingenuity, and their willingness not to allow anything to stand in their way.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing that story and all of those stories. As you can see, the Tuskegee Airmen had a lot to deal with. in the military and outside of the military. There's a section of the Tuskegee Airmen that not too many people know about, and that is their bomber group. They flew B-25s.
Right.
There were 992, I believe, pilots who graduated from Tuskegee and went on to fly. Of those, roughly 420 were twin-engine pilots, and they were the B-25 pilots. They never saw action. They trained an inordinate number of hours for a variety of reasons. One, the military did not want them to fly over Europe. They did not want them to fly there, and I'm quoting some of those members of Tuskegee Airmen who were members of the 477th. They felt that the Army Air Corps was not comfortable sending them over to bomb, quote unquote, white personnel in Europe. It was okay to send fighters over to shoot down or fly against planes where it was one or two, but to bomb indiscriminately or as a mission multitude of white people, they were destined against that. As the war progressed, they were going to be trained to go and fight and fly missions in Japan. So there was a difference of where they were allowed to fly and where they would not be allowed to fly. They did fight a different battle, known as the Freeman Field Mutiny. What happened was there was an extremely segregationist and commander of that particular air base, and he sent up for two officers' clubs, one for the blacks, one for the whites. When the blacks protested and said, "We are officers," and at that time, whites did not have to salute black officers. They were not forced to, but anyone else who was an officer, they had to salute. Black officers, they did not have to salute. But this, Selway, I believe, was the commander of that air base, and he set up two separate officers' clubs. The black pilot said, "We're not going to do that, we're going to the other one." So they began walking in and trying to gain admittance to the white officers' club. They were turned away time after time, but they would go back. The next time they would go back, and they would go back again. Finally, three officers went in, and they were blocked, and one pushed aside the officer that was blocking him. They were arrested. They were arrested for assault on an officer, and they were taken and interned. The Colonel Selway, who commanded that base, decided that he would send out a letter that he wanted everyone to sign that they understood that there were two separate officers' clubs. The black pilots refused to sign. At that time, that was considered mutinous, and one of the punishments included death. They still refused to sign. Thanks to the pressure from NAACP and other organizations in the United States, they were reprieved and released from their incarceration. Three members, the original three, however, were not. Two of them were eventually vindicated. The third was fined $150 and was dishonorably discharged from the service. The prosecution in that case wanted the death penalty for him protecting himself against an officer trying to stop him from entering the club. But that did not go through, and eventually it took roughly 30 years for his record to be cleared after that happened. He still had that dishonorable discharge on his record. And that is where the 477th made its point in history. Because of them and standing up to the segregationists in that Army Air Corps at that time, they paved the way for the desegregation of the military, which happened in 1948 with President Truman signing into effect the equal opportunity for everyone to serve in any portion, any part of the military. It didn't specifically say desegregate, but it opened the door by saying everyone will have the opportunity to serve in any facet of the military and not be segregated that way. There were roughly 16,000 involved in the Tuskegee Airmen experience. During 1941 to 1945, it was called the Tuskegee Experiment. that name was changed so that it would not be confused with another Tuskegee experiment that was strictly medical. And if you're not familiar with that, take a look at what it was. It had to do with exposing blacks to syphilis just to see what would happen. And that's the Tuskegee experiment as it stands now. The Tuskegee experience involves everyone involved with Tuskegee from 1941 to 1949, when it was totally, their unit was completely integrated, so that was no longer separate. And as far as the 477th, I'm going to ask Judge Mark Whiten to talk about his father's experience as a B-25 pilot.
Well, I'll tell you this. I've been a partner in a Wall Street law firm, a judge of the criminal court, city of New York, and a state judge as well. I've been a adjunct professor and an advisor to the dean of New York Law School. But what brings me more pride than anything other than my twin daughters is my bloodlines to my father and my uncle, who were both Tuskegee Airmen. My uncle was, grew up, he actually lived in Roosevelt, Long Island, and he worked there until he passed away, and he was a member of the 99th Pursuit Squadron. You've heard of them, the Red Tails. He flew in Italy, and he flew a number of missions and was greatly honored, and my cousins hold his memory extremely high, as do I. My father was his friend. They met through, although they were a class apart, they met through their Tuskegee Association and training. He was assigned to the 477 composite bomber group. And as you know, they did not deploy. And I know that one of his greatest, as it was for all of those bomber pilots, one of their greatest disappointments in life was that they didn't get to be in the fight in Europe. But the thing is, what we understand of the Tuskegee groups is that there were two battles going on. We call it the double victory. There was a victory in Europe over fascism, and there was victory at home in beginning what could really be called the civil rights movement. The mutiny that you heard about was part of the civil rights movement. The other things that these airmen did was part of the civil rights movement. My father, I'll tell you a couple of quick things. For one thing, I never understood how my grandfather, a fine gentleman with 7 children, living in Atlanta, Georgia, allowed 2 of these flyboys from Tuskegee, Alabama to come over there, meet his daughters at a dance. They were both Spelman young ladies, and they met them at a dance at Morehouse, which was a regular thing that went on at the time. They trained and they trained and they trained. They needed to let off steam. So they'd fly to Atlanta, and they would go to the parties. In this case, they met 2 young ladies, and one gentleman became my uncle because of that. And my father married my mother, and I'm happy that happened because that's why I'm here. But that's kind of interesting. My father never jumped out of an airplane. They were the best trained units in the United States Air Force, or Army Air Corps at the time, because what they did was train and train and train. And they trained under adverse conditions because they weren't given the proper equipment. They were usually put on bases that were not able to officially and appropriately accommodate them. The officers' clubs were jiggered. Everything was done to try to wash these gentlemen out before 992 of them came through Tuskegee, and then after, during their training before they were deployed, they tried everything to wash them out. And they just weren't that successful. So while my uncle was flying in Italy, my father was flying in the United States. He had a number of different experiences, and one I only recently learned about, and it's kind of colorful, but it involves the only time that he actually dropped his bombs. Because why would you drop bombs if you didn't deploy? And he was flying a bomber. Well, the story goes that he was flying a bomber. He was headed back. He was low on fuel. His full crew was there. He radios to the local base, the base closest to him in Alabama, that he needed permission to land so that he could refuel and continue on to his home base. The base in Alabama denied him access. They said, "You can't land here, no access." My father was not the airmen. They were all educated. They all had college education. They were gentlemen. but they were not the kind of guys that you really want to get in their way too much. We used to call him Big Joe Whiten. So I understand my father radioed to the tower, well, if you're not going to allow me to land, and my only other choice is to crash, I'm going to have to lighten my load. They still did not give him permission to land at the airbase, so he lightened his load. He dropped 2 of his bombs on the airbase within the circumference of the airbase, not on the runways, not on anybody and not on any structures, but if you know anything about those air bases, they encompass a lot of land. So he dropped ordnance, he lightened his load, he returned back to his base fully expecting to be court-martialed, but he wasn't. So I can only assume that the local air base felt that they really wouldn't be able to justify their denial of an American crew to land and refuel or crash. So they didn't want to go up against that and the fact that there were explosions that night that kept the neighbors wondering. Okay, these are the kind of things that they had to do, whether it was acquire their own tanks, whether it was find a way to lighten your load to keep everybody alive. These bomber pilots were so accurate and so good at what they did that they would sometimes spice things up a bit, and they would fly their B-25s under bridges. Now, we're not talking about a P-51, which is basically a small airplane that can do a number of acrobatic movements. Bombers aren't made to do that. But these men could fly under bridges. My father did it. There was an incident where somebody else did it not so well and ended up crashing the bomber. But they were well trained. They expected that they would return to the United States and go work for Pan Am or TWA or some airline like that because they had more flight time and experience than anybody who was flying the big jets that we had at that time. They weren't the jumbos at that point. But when they came back, there were no doors that were open to them. There were very few Tuskegee Airmen that returned regardless of their experience and found work in the airlines. My uncle, who fought in Italy, who was honored for being a red tail flying this plane, could work in a lumberyard. My father sold insurance. Okay, this is what they came back to. And what's kind of very disappointing about it, I know there was some bitterness for their lives as they went forward, because they basically hit the pinnacle of their lives when they were about 22 years old. That's when they flew high, they flew at the Angels, they represented their country well. They weren't rewarded when they came home, but they passed on to their children a respect for the military, for the mission, because the mission is more important than the racists who may control it. Okay, the mission of preserving this country, its ideals, and its possibility for our children is the greatest mission that there can be. They taught us that, and that's why we continue to hold their legacy up high.
I was just going to say, some of them weren't able to go on and do, like fly and do things directly that was related to being an airman. My father went through Army administration school, and he was able to use those skills to start a business. Rise high in the post office, starting as a clerk and then rise high, and then he was in upper management and sold insurance, do things that he was able to take care of his family. And so even though a lot of them didn't get to work for Pan Am and do some of those other kinds of things, some of you were too young, don't know about Pan Am. They were able to, they used those skills. That's how they were resourceful. They used those skills in other ways in order to take care of their families and then to serve their communities. As each one of them, you can say what they did, what they did after the war.
You should note that none of those pilots who flew either the P-51s or the bombers could have ever got off the ground but for the flight crews. So there were at least, I believe, 1,500 other
who they
members
swore couldn't learn to fix a plane.
who were able to be top mechanics, were able to get those planes even without the proper equipment and get them in the air and keep them in the air. So that's why as an organization, we honor everyone who is part of that Tuskegee program.
In the beginning, they took all the planes the others didn't want that were in the junk pile, and they took all the parts to make one good plane for the pilot. I'm Pat with 2 T's. My last name is Terralong. I'm one of the past presidents of the Tri-State chapter. My mother, my father, all our godparents were part of that experience. We had an apartment, and a lot of the airmen came through there while they looked for jobs and tried to figure out where they were going to go. I grew up with Span Watson and all the children, and I heard a lot of stories, a lot of stories. For instance, when Chief Anderson took Eleanor Roosevelt, they told her, okay, fly around the base and just land. When she got in the plane in the air, she said, take me, and I don't remember it was Montgomery or Birmingham. So this black man disappears with First Lady for an hour. I can't imagine what that would look like in the media today. My dad, he was a pilot. During World War II, aerial engineers were pilots. I pulled his military records. Harry Stewart he was one of the pilots that took the first gunnery meet in their class. They stole their trophy. They didn't expect them to win. And it took us 55 years, I think, to find it. And he told me my dad graduated with him in class 44F, June 27th, 1944. They were at Kessler Field together. And Harry is still with us as well. My father was actually only 15. And he graduated from Aviation High School, which was located in Manhattan at the time. And he went to movies. He was enrolled in City College. He went to the movies in Times Square and saw these planes landing on the carriers, you know? And he said, oh, this is what I want to do. And he went right down to 42nd Street Navy recruiting office. And they took a test, and the guy came out, and he says, if I don't call your name, it means you fail. Leave. My father's name was not called. He knew there was no way he could have failed that test. So he's sitting there steaming, knowing if he acts out, his mother's going to beat him when he gets home. And he was trying to figure out how to do this. And the guy comes out and says, what are you still doing here, boy? And he said, sir, I'd like to see my test results. So he took him in the back, and he said, son, the Navy's never going to let you be a pilot. He said, you had the top grade. I'm going to write you a letter. You take it down to Whitehall Street, and don't give this letter to anybody else but who it's addressed to. To the day he died, he wished he had seen what was in that letter. Well, he failed the weight requirement. So he had to drink a pound of water. They found out he was from Jamaica originally. My grandmother, his mother, was the first black nurse hired by the city of New York. And he had to write to Washington to get proof that he could serve as a naturalized citizen. He did that. He went back, and they found they had his birth date wrong on his birth certificate, so they thought he was 16. And they said, oh, no, you have to have your mother sign. So he went home, and Grandma wasn't signing. And she said, if God had wanted you to fly, you would have been born as a bird. So his sister borrowed his mother's signature. To this day, I don't know whether she was just trying to get rid of a pesky little brother or she was trying to help him. So Grandma comes home from work to find her son, who was actually 15, on a train to Alabama. My father didn't know what snow was. He thought it was smoke. You know? So somehow he survived it, and according to his military records, he taught flight. He trained flight in South Dakota. He was transferred to Texas and then to South Dakota before coming home. We know all the stories because we grew up around them. For instance, I'm going to let you tell about Mount Vesuvius. However, there are still things we're not allowed to talk about that we know of, because even though 20-some-odd years have passed, it's still top security. So we can't tell those stories. But if you want to know all the gossip, I got it. If you want a quick question, I'll take that too. One.
Ms. Montgomery?
Okay.
Ms. Terrelong mentioned Mount Vesuvius. Well, where they were stationed in Ramatelli, my husband said that one day the mountain blew its top, and all of the dust and the ash came flying down to their camp and broke down the tents that they were sleeping under. Well, he said they had to put on gas masks in order to breathe and not inhale this dust. And he said they were shoveling and shoveling and shoveling. They looked like they would never stop shoveling. But Mount Vesuvius now erupted back in the 1500s, but I guess when they were stationed there in Ramatelli, Mount Vesuvius said, okay, I'm gonna welcome you. Boom, and all of a sudden all this dust came down on them. And he said they wore those masks for about a week because it was just that much eruption that had happened. So they had quite an experience, but they survived it all in the meantime. But I just wanted to say, I forgot, in mentioning the Great Train Robbery, there is a book that you can buy on Amazon by Lieutenant Colonel James C. Warren, United States Air Force retired, and it's called The Great Train Robbery, a Tuskegee Airmen Saga.
Thank you very much.
We can hold this open.
Yeah, my father told me that when they landed, you know, because they all were on ships coming over, not like we do now, just fly over, that when they were coming into port, that all they could see is sunken ships everywhere, because there had been bombings before that. And so can you imagine being, you know, these were relatively young people. You see some lied about their age and were even younger, and then the max being like 22 years old. And some enlisted. My father was drafted. He was actually a college student, working at night, and was actually drafted into the military, and had been as I mentioned to you, he had been in Army Administration School. He did so well that they retained him they wanted to retain him as an instructor, which he was for a period. But when he heard that his cadre was getting ready to ship out, he asked to be released so that he can go back to his unit. Because if they leave you, then, you know, you're separated. He wanted to make sure that he left and was able to travel with his group.
When we heard the story originally, we were doing a presentation for some children that was coming from Suffolk County, and we were in the basement of a church, and Darlene was videotaping us. Now, I knew Bill Wheeler, and some of you knew him. Like I said, I'm blessed to be around all these guys and women that were part of this, but he said when they came up from Tuskegee to Norfolk to board the ship, he went into a restaurant to get some food before he boarded. They wouldn't serve him because he was a, quote, Negro. However, the German prisoners were sitting in the restaurant eating with the MPs. So he went back to the ship, told the guys, and somehow they got some food. I don't know how, but they were a little concerned while they were traveling on the ship because, according to your father, if they had friendly fire, they would wipe out the entire Black Army Air Corps. So they said they were going to the sun, and all of a sudden they realized they were running from the sun, and some German planes came down, and somebody else fought them off. When they got to Italy, that area had been bombed. It was January, it was raining, it was cold. Yeah. And so they couldn't light a fire. They took them into the mountain when Mount Vesuvius erupted that night. So I said, well, did the Ku Klux Klan start looking good about now? They said, no, we're here to fight. They were really on it. So we got to know some of the men who took out the first jets. We knew one of the guys who took out the ship. Lee Archer used to say, just tell me I can't. I'm going to show you I can. And that has been my motto all my life. My sisters and I weren't invited to D.C. to the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony. We showed up with our kids. And we gate crashed. The guys used to call us the first White House gate crashers. And we were at the ceremony, and it was something that even my great-grandchildren are members of the chapter. One of my great-nieces is flying a plane. They all have taken on this experience. Thank you.
I'd like to take a minute, please. We're going to take advantage of where we are. And we have two gentlemen here who actually are pilots of the planes that were flown by the Tuskegee Airmen. If you'd like to come forward, gentlemen, and share your knowledge, your feelings about piloting these planes, what's peculiar about them, what's great about them. And gentlemen, if you don't mind, we have Jeff and we have Max.
How's everybody doing? Okay. All right. So you're at the American AIRPOWER Museum. This is our exhibit, obviously, of the Tuskegee Airmen. This airplane above us is an exact replica of the P-51 Mustang that we have down over there that we fly. It's going to be flying in the air show tomorrow. This aircraft, I had a P-51 Mustang some time ago in the late 90s. We'd taken it apart, and I knew some folks out in California at Hollywood, and they made things for the movie theaters. And so what they did was they made molds off of my airplane, and I had this airplane, my airplane replicated down to the last screw and rivet, and everything you see on this is exactly what the original Mustang had. You can go see our Mustang over there. So before I start talking about flying the aircraft, what's interesting, so this aircraft, when we decided to create this, when we opened, which was in 2001, prior to that, we designed, and this was part of the opening, an exhibit honoring the Tuskegee Airmen. I happened to have been, at the time, friendly with Dr. Roscoe Brown from City University, and also Lee Archer. So, and I had also had experience meeting a fellow named Chappie James, who at the time was a colonel, full colonel. He was vice wing commander of the 8th Fighter Wing, but eventually became commander of North American Air Defense Command and a 4-star. And so I had some in-depth knowledge of, apart from being with and serving with people whose forebears and ancestors were part of the 332nd and the 100th Fighter Squadron. And so we decided to paint this in the colors of Lee Archer, Ina the Macon Bell. So this is a replica of Lee Archer's Mustang up here. The Mustang that we have in the museum is a very unique aircraft. It's one of the few that actually went over to Europe in World War II and was delivered in November of 1944 to Italy, to the Foggia air complex, of which Ramitelli was part of. It was a replacement aircraft, of which there were a number. This aircraft actually never made it out of the depot. It was a brand new airplane. Obviously, they didn't need it, and it was constantly getting upgrades. So by the time the war wound to a close toward the end of the spring of 1945, and they'd done all their modifications on it, the tech orders and specific things to the engine and the propeller and the armament and everything else, and they put a new gun sight in, a more modern gun sight that it had originally. There was no use for it in European theaters, so it was shipped home and then used by the U.S. Air Force. It's a kind of a perfect, it's a time capsule because it's pretty much almost identical to when it was being used by the Air National Guard in the United States after it was brought back to the States. It was not one of those airplanes that were left over in Europe because it was brand new and perfect. but it probably could have been a replacement aircraft for either the 332nd or the 100th, because it was in the Foggia complex, and you only had two fighter outfits there. You had the Checkertails, I think it was the 52nd Fighter Group, and you had the 332nd and the 100th, the 332nd Fighter Group and the 100th Fighter Squadron. Anyway, flying the Mustang is a little bit different than the P-40 Warhawk, which the 100th Fighter Squadron got. That was the first plane they got in fighter in North Africa. And of course, you know, we all know that they weren't, their missions were mostly air to ground, and they weren't encouraged to engage the enemy aircraft. And there was an obvious reason for that. We all know that. And and they were keeping that for another group that also had P-40s. But nevertheless, they did exemplary service in North Africa. And then when North Africa moved up to Italy, and the Foggia, which is in kind of the middle south of Italy, and particularly Ramitelli, they brought their P-40s with them. And then the P-40s were converted to P-47 Thunderbolts, 9,000 of which were made here, where we stand in this building and the complex here. And then from there, they got their Mustangs. So, you know, we have this progression of aircraft that once they got the Mustang, it was like a new ball game. And what's interesting about the P-51 is that it's, as a civilian-operated aircraft, it's relatively straightforward and relatively forgiving if you operate it in a forgiving manner. That is, if you keep it straight and level, and you follow the manual and fly it by the book. It's, you know, similar. It's similar in concept in terms of flying by the book. You fly by the numbers, but it's an amazing aircraft because it was designed as, you know, a killing machine. This aircraft was the fastest aircraft we had. It did everything that could be asked for a fighter aircraft. Well. Was it the best in any particular category? No. Was it the best overall in all categories? Probably yes. Flat out, it was fast. Faster than the German aircraft. Excuse me. It had a 12-cylinder Packard-built model of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. That's a V12, liquid-cooled, kind of like your car engine, except it put out about 1,590 horsepower, or 1,600, yeah, about 1,590, I think. The airplane could go up to almost 40,000 feet, if need be, if you can imagine that without pressurization. So the pilots that flew these, the 100th and the 332nd, they would go up high, and their mission was to escort bombers, and it had nothing to do with, at the time, it really had nothing to do with not wanting him to let him be an ace. It had to do with confirmations. So you had a lot of other pilots, if they didn't get gun camera film, or they didn't have confirmation from other pilots that they actually saw an airplane go in because one of our guys knocked it down, then you didn't get credit, or sometimes you had to share credit. But the airplane is relatively, I said, docile. In terms of flying these airplanes, if you fly a P-40 and you fly it with quality, you can fly one of these things. The airspeeds in this airplane are much higher, and it had a particular, the reason that it went pretty fast really quickly and could accelerate fast was because of the aerodynamic shape of the wing. It was called a laminar flow, which the way the wing is curved on the top and on the bottom permitted less drag, and the frontal area of this airplane is very narrow. So sitting in the cockpit of this airplane, it's a very small cockpit, and it's kind of like squeezing yourself into an F-16 today. F-16 is barely the size of this cockpit here. So you take off similarly as like a P-40, which is the shark-mouthed airplane we have over there. and the same techniques are applied. The only thing is that there's a lot of power, a lot more power here, so you have to be a little bit more careful when you take off. And the climb out, depending, it was a fairly fast climbing airplane. Not the fastest, but fairly fast. And when you got up to higher altitude, the P-40 could only do its best work up to about 10 or 12,000 feet. When you started getting up to 15,000 feet, it got really sluggish because of the way the engine and the supercharger, the mechanism in the engine worked. In this airplane, you had a system that permitted this airplane to get up to very high altitude so that it could get above the bombers that it escorted. And the 332nd Fighter Group and the 100th Fighter Squadron, which were the two Tuskegee fighter elements at Ramitelli, flew basically, they had to fly within and around the bomber formations, which was sort of tricky because they had to slow up. And this airplane is a fast airplane and it just doesn't want to fly slow. Sometimes you have to put out 20 degrees of flap, which are those boardy things that are in the rear of the wing over here, to slow it up slightly. And you had to weave among the bomber formations so that you could both give confidence to the bomber pilots that they were protected. That was a big deal in those days.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's
okay.
good. You gave us a lot of information.
Okay.
I want to make sure
sure.
that Max gets a chance to talk
Oh,
about
I'm
the
sorry.
B-25.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Roscoe believed in the 3 Ps. For any child that's here, come get your free dog tag of the 3 Ps. Because practice makes perfect. I know you heard that in school. Roscoe told me that he was able to learn to manipulate the rudder, and there were times when he could make a sharp left, drop down, and come up behind the jet.
He has a mic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for letting me be part of your presentation
Thank
here.
you for
I
sharing
appreciate
your
it.
information.
Okay. Here you go.
You're up.
Well, my name is Max Hodges, and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. And I get invited up here to come up here and fly the B-25 quite often. It's been 2 years. I flew it the last 2 days, and it's the first time that the airplane's been up in 2 years, and I got to come up and test it. And I was actually the last one that flew it 2 years ago. I do have an interesting story for you guys. It's not that interesting, but I got to fly with, I don't remember who it was, but in Atlanta, Georgia, about 5 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, I took one of the Tuskegee Airmen up in an airplane called Killer B. And I let him, he got to fly and take off out of Peachtree DeKalb Airport.
Is that McGee?
Yes.
Charles McGee.
General,
McGee.
that's right. I got to fly with him. So.
Those are his Ps, by the way.
Okay. Well, anyway, I was asked to speak about the airplanes a little bit. Of course, everything that they flew is out here on the floor except for the steerman. And so they got in the progression of flying everything like Jeff was saying, up through the P-40, the T-6s out there, what they flew, and then the progression to the P-40 and the P-51. And then later on, they moved up to the B-25. Now, this particular airplane right here, this B-25 here, happens to be one of the oldest, or the oldest, flyable B-25 in the country. There's only about 42 that are left flying or in flyable condition, and there were nearly 10,000 of those airplanes built. They were flown in every theater of the war, and they were used in every different possible scenarios you could come up with. It's considered a medium bomber, and it was for medium altitude bombing raids. However, that didn't work in the Pacific Islands. In the Pacific Islands, they developed different type bombing, skip bombing, where they would roll and come over at the treetop levels. There were several different models of this one. Now, this is an early model. This is the 4th airplane off the production line. And if you notice the tail, if you ever look at the tail, this tail is different than the normal B-25 because they have 2 machine guns out the back and have a little bubble on the back. And this is a relatively fast airplane compared to the other B-25s because they had all the turrets and all the guns off the side, and all the machine guns. But this one is really fast. Now, and the history of this airplane is pretty interesting too, because this airplane had a different wing on it when it was built. And it had a straight wing on it, and a straight wing does not lend stability to the aircraft. So it had to have, they put a dihedral on it. So they turned the wings down and put a negative dihedral to take this aircraft and make it stable in flight. This particular airplane also was flown by the same squadron that the Jimmy Doolittle Raiders did that took off the aircraft carrier. But Hap Arnold came back when they took the wings off of it and put the negative dihedral. Hap Arnold came out and wanted to know which was the fastest airplane. He chose this one. And so they made an executive version out of it, cut the bomb bay in half so it could go back and forth, and they used it that way. Several different models. I mean, just like cars and everything, every year the production, they would change, and they'd change a lot of them right in the production line. And out in the Pacific, a lot of the changes were made out by the crew chiefs in the Pacific in the field. Well, the Air Force, or the Army Air Corps at the time, had the engineers said, we got to have some changes that do it. So they sent the engineers out in the Pacific. They came back, took pictures of it, and saw what they were doing, and came back to the States and redesigned the nose and different aspects of it to where they could fly it. They added machine guns. One of them, there's only one left, it's called an H model, and it's got a 20 millimeter cannon, the same cannon that's on a Sherman tank. And that thing would be awesome shooting. Boy, I wanted to shoot it bad. But also have 4 machine guns in the nose. And then they made one for the Marines, had 8 machine guns vertically, all 50 calibers in the machine gun. And then you had side guns on both sides of the cockpit, and then if the turret had things, so you had a lot of firepower coming out at you at the front. And it was very successful in the Pacific in doing ship raids, anti-personnel raids, the skip bombings, the parachute bombs. You can see, if you go on YouTube, you can see them when they drop out. They'd have delayed bombs. They didn't have delayed fuses, but they put parachutes to slow them down so the airplane could exceed past the blast area so they wouldn't shoot themselves down. No, it's
armored.
30 thousandths.
Right, and the ordnance that was being fired at these planes was between 3 and 8 inches long. You could see them in the gift shop. That's
Sure.
what was being fired at these planes. And the skin was how thick?
30 thousandths, very small. And
why
they do have armament positions. They have hardened armament positions that they put. They put side panels, and there's one behind the pilots. But it was minimal protection. But
That's why they needed the protection of these fighters. Right?
That's correct. However, the down low, the worst part for even these airplanes was down low, because you can, instead of one gun shooting at you, you may have 1,000 guns shooting at you. So you have to try to get in and get out pretty fast. This particular airplane flies about 170 knots. It's a good flying airplane. She's probably one of the better airplanes that I fly. I fly about 4 different ones of this model airplane. It's a great airplane to fly. And we just love to take care of it and honor the veterans. You're a veteran. My dad actually flew B-25s, and so I'm kind of carrying on my dad's heritage by getting able to honor my dad by flying his airplane. And he didn't go overseas because his graduation class was the end of 45 or end of 44, and they didn't need pilots at that time. They were already flooded. They were already winding down the war at that time. And the pilot, like Jeff said, they were they were stockpiling airplanes, so they didn't need pilots. So he was able not to go, but he did finish his pilot training in the B-25. And so
Actually,
that guy,
my father actually did get his orders to go. He received his orders to deploy. He was given 2-week terminal leave to get his affairs in orders before he left. And then somebody dropped a bomb on.
yeah, there's something about that. They quit fighting
And
for some reason.
armistice came, and he was so disappointed. But of the 420 pilots that deployed and the 90-some that were shot down, 66 were killed. Who knows if I would have been here? So, sir, when you head back to Atlanta, I got a lot of relatives back there. If I could scoot along with you, I'll come right. And I'd get you a nice meal.
Okay, all
In
right.
Atlanta.
Well, I live in Noonan,
Okay.
if you know Noonan, Peachtree City area.
I just know where the closest
But
McDonald's is.
the airplane as it sits right now flies about 26,000 pounds. The military actually operated it up to 32,000 pounds, and that's quite a lot that's almost to the B-17 weight. But if you lost an engine in this airplane, it was, if you're on takeoff, you were pretty much toast.
No.
You landed straight ahead. If you didn't, you hit a VMC problem, and if you weren't careful, you could be upside down in the trees on the end of the runway. So it's a very demanding airplane to fly, but it's a very fun airplane to fly. And as he said, as Jeff said, it's not a fighter, but sometimes some people want to fly it as a fighter, but it is getting aged, and we try not to pull too much power on it. I've come from I try to be conservative on how we fly it, because we want it to stay around for a long time. So all these young people can see it, because I don't think they're going to really realize what our forefathers did in flying these things and what they went through to get there. And you guys know that probably more so than I do. But I'm very honored to be part of the American AIRPOWER, to be here. They allow me to come up, and I'm really flabbergasted that I'm speaking for them in this case. But I do get to fly their airplane, and they invite me to come back, and I love that. I have made lots of friends, and I hope that I did you very well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate your sharing.
We're doing such a great job over there. Your daddy didn't have to go.
I might not have been here if you did.
Yeah. My dad failed.
Thank you very much, Max. Jeff, you too? Thank you to the American AIRPOWER Museum for allowing us to come in here and share information about the Tuskegee Airmen, and for those two pilots to share information about these planes that were used by the Tuskegee Airmen. Mrs. Montgomery would like to show you the Congressional Gold Medal that they were awarded in 2007 by President Bush.
This is a replica of the Congressional Gold Medal that was presented to them by President George Bush on March 29th, 2007, under the Capitol Rotunda. Now, the actual gold medal, and it is gold, 24-karat gold, is in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum on the 2nd floor. And it is beautiful, okay? But this is bronze. This is bronze, it's not gold, okay? But I wanted you all to see this because this was quite an honor. It took them 65 years to recognize these heroes. But it did happen, so here it is. And if you like to see it, I'll show it to you. You just can't touch.
We're going to be dedicating a wall at New York Law School on September 24 to the Tuskegee Airmen that will have a lot of memorabilia, and it will also, there's going to be one of the airmen who has now passed away. One of his medals is going to be presented to New York Law School to be included in that Tuskegee wall. So we hope to keep the legacy alive, and we need you to help us do that, to spread the word, to join an organization if you can, and at least to make sure that your local schools are teaching about these true American heroes. We need you.
Follow us on Instagram and on Facebook.
Please.
Okay, as I was saying, when I was so wonderfully interrupted, on the back of the coin are 3 planes. Now, Miss Taralong has the U.S. Mint. I don't know if you have seen that the U.S. Mint has struck gold. Is it quarters?
Quarters.
And Miss Taralong says she has something to give out to the children that are present. So you're blessed if you can get one. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming and listening to these wonderful people speak about the Tuskegee Airmen. They have knowledge that no one else has because they were there. And that's why it's so important for them to express what their interaction with their parents, the stories they have. They have many more stories. There is a flyer going around that gives you how to keep in contact with us. Our website, nyctai.org. Please look us up. We have a YouTube link. We have a Facebook link. Take a look. This particular session is recorded. It is live streamed, I think. If not, please feel free to contact us. Join the group. We meet every 3rd Saturday of the month, except for July and August, at JFK. When we do meet live. Right now we're still doing virtual meetings because of COVID. But in any case, there are some wonderful stories, and I myself had the extreme pleasure and honor of meeting some of these wonderful gentlemen, Tuskegee Airmen, before they passed on. And that is why I am here, because their story, their personality, their dedication, their perseverance was something I could not overlook. They inspired me to dedicate more and more time to getting their story out. They were funny, they were ambitious, and in their 90s, their mind was sharp as a tack. And when they were ready to tackle a project, it went straight on the same way they did their missions during World War II. They did more than when they were in World War II. They went on to other things where they made groundbreaking news, which we don't hear about. The implosion of the World Trade Center that saved lives. That particular, that particular creation was done by a Tuskegee Airman, a former Tuskegee Airman, and I don't want to use that term former. Once a Tuskegee Airman, they're always a Tuskegee Airman. 16,000 strong, plus. That's the pilots, the ground crew, the nurses, everybody involved. It was all a package deal. And they stuck together like glue. And they still stick together like glue. There aren't many left alive, but their memory is what we're trying to preserve and what their mission is. For those young people here, remember, education is the key. The more you know, the more you know, and the more you realize you don't know. All right? There's always something to learn every single day. Put it in your sights to learn something new every day, something that helps somebody every day, something that boosts someone every day. We have enough that says you don't need to be here. They faced so many people saying, you don't need to be here, you don't belong here. And they said, you're wrong. And I'm going to stick it out until you say, yes, I belong here. And if it means I have to take this, I will take it, because that's my mission. And that's our mission. Please join us on Facebook, become a member, and do whatever you can to support us. Yes.
I would like to ask a question. Can I tell one last juicy story on Span Watson, who lived on Long Island? Do we have time?
No, go ahead.
Okay. When Span turned 90, Lockheed Martin invited us up to do a program up there at the company, and we saw the helicopter and all the planes and everything. But it was his birthday, so I ran around and got a lot of stuff. So we hosted a birthday party on a last-minute deal. And he told me a story. When they were stationed at Walterboro, Span had married Edna, and she was in an apartment. Walterboro's in South Carolina. Span had a new car. He got a flat tire. He went to get the tire fixed. 3 days later, that tire still wasn't fixed. So he walked up to one of the black guys and said, you know, what's going on? I left my car here and it's still not fixed. He said, you have to talk to the owner. So turns out the owner was the sheriff of the town. And he got a little loud with Span, and he went to hit him, and Span ducked and knocked him out. Well, now he's got to get out of there. So he heads back to the base. They're forming a mob to come through the front door. Span tells me he had to go get his, well, he said he was going for his gun, but he told them he was going for his wife. And they got in the car and went out the back door, back gate, as they stormed through the front gate. They closed that base. They were so upset. That's a lot of people they put out of work. That's how angry they were. So back in the 80s, they invited back to Waldoboro for the commemorative unflagging of the stone, the statue, and everything. It was beautiful. I've been there. And the mayor's talking, having this long conversation. He says, okay, which one of you knocked out my uncle? So now all the guys are going, finally Span took off his hat and he said, it was me. And he said, he's thinking, oh God, they waited this long to get me back here to lynch me? So, and finally he owned up to it, and the mayor said, he deserved it. So that was my last story.
Thank you. Go ahead.
It's over.
Go ahead.
Hello again. In case anyone was wondering what else we do with our community, with our youth, if you are a high school senior, you are eligible to apply for our tuition assistance, for our scholarship program. So please check out our website, you know, do your due diligence and apply. It's an annual scholarship that we award obviously every year.
In relation to the tuition assistance program, if you are currently a high school junior, you can apply next year as a senior, because it's now, the scholarship program is over for this year. So please take a look.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Turnbull. I am
Speak up, speak up.
My name is Mike Turnbull. I am the treasurer of Tuskegee Airmen Inc., Claude Govan Tri-State Chapter. I'm also a member of Black Pilots of America, the New York chapter, and we are putting together a program where we are introducing aviation to the youth and anyone who wants to fly. We normally do free flights with EAA. We collaborate with EAA, and we give free flights to the kids that come out at Brookhaven Airport, and sometimes we do it in Jersey. Now, EAA is a bigger organization, and they are able to fund that and give free flights. So our program is slightly different, where we are trying to get funding and sponsors to, you know, help us present aviation to the youth and anybody that want to fly. You can check our website, our Facebook. The information will be there, and I hope to see some of you soon, and bring your kids, spread the word.
It's going to be ages 13 to 17. Just watch our site as the information goes up. We'll be having those flights. They won't cost the kids anything. We're going to get it funded.
So
That's our goal.
So in addition to that, Mike, don't forget we are also going to collaborate. But for this pandemic, it was supposed to be a youth corps program within our chapter. We were going to set some things up in terms of drone instruction. So they'll be able to actually fly drones, because I am FAA certified to fly drones. In addition to that, we're going to incorporate a mentorship program as well. So there are a lot of exciting things that we want to do and we are doing for the community, especially our youth, because they are our future. But, you know, have patience and please inform others and share this information, so this way we can get these kids on a path that's on the right path. I mean, the legacy of the Airmen is very encouraging and powerful, so why not pass that information on to them moving forward?
And I forgot to mention, I'm also a private pilot, and I have 2 aircraft on this airport, And we also have 7 throughout our BPA organization. But the planes that we use to, do these flights are, like I said, are on this airport. And we train how to fly as well. And you were saying something?
My niece took her first flight with you, and now she's flying.
Exactly. So
Time is up.
So he knows what he's doing.
if
Okay.
you bring your kids out, I might be one of the pilots that take your kids out.
Thank you.
What about the Civil Air Patrol? Please mention them.
They're out in Brentwood. We have a Civil Air Patrol squadron based in Brentwood called the Spirit of Tuskegee. That was started 3 years ago, and it's tied in with this chapter. So please look them up as well. Again, look us up on Facebook, visit our website, and get more information. Become a part of history. Thank you again to Judge Whiten, Dr. DeFore, Ms. Terrelong, and Mrs. Montgomery for sharing your stories, and thank you to you for staying here and listening to us. Give you information.
Okay.
I call it the adventure with the Tuskegee Airmen as the second greatest adventure in my life for several reasons. Because I did what I wanted to do, I did the impossible. Okay? The opportunity wasn't there for blacks to fly. They say blacks cannot fly. But the door cracked open and I walked through, me and others. And the wonderful men that I trained with were wonderful young men, okay? I guess it was because we were all of the same ilk, more or less. We were ambitious. We wanted to do things. We had our pride, okay? From there, I went to Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, okay? And me and a number of other PACs, they call us PACs, Pre-Aviation Cadets. And we got there and we were housed in the building. And I think on D-Day, I got to D-Day. And I was so happy. Because when I got there and I went down to the flying line, etc. And when I saw those black pilots come down and swoop down and buzz the tail and go up and down and make a slow roll or snap roll, etc. I was so excited. I said, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do.
I can still see the excitement on your
Okay, it certainly was. I was so proud and so happy, okay, to be there. And because that's what I wanted for a long period of time. Like I said before, growing up and looking at the skies there when I was a youngster, they wouldn't allow blacks to fly. I knew no matter how many planes I saw flying over military planes, I knew there were no blacks in there. Okay. I call it the adventure with the Tuskegee Airmen as the second greatest adventure in my life for several reasons. Because I did what I wanted to do, I did the impossible, okay? The opportunity wasn't there for blacks to fly. They say blacks cannot fly. But the door cracked open and I walked through, me and others. And the wonderful men that I trained with were wonderful young men, okay? I guess it was because we were all of the same ilk, more or less. We were ambitious. We wanted to do things. We had our pride, okay? From there, I went to Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, okay? And me and a number of other PACs, they call us PACs, Pre-Aviation Cadets. And we got there and we were housed in the building. And I think on D-Day, I got to D-Day. And I was so happy. Because when I got there and I went down to the flying line, etc. And when I saw those black pilots come down and swoop down and buzz the tail and go up and down and make a slow roll or snap roll, etc. I was so excited. I said, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do.
I can still see the excitement on your
Okay, it certainly was. I was so proud and so happy, okay, to be there. And because that's what I wanted for a long period of time. Like I said before, growing up and looking at the skies there when I was a youngster, they wouldn't allow blacks to fly. I knew no matter how many planes I saw flying over military planes, I knew there were no blacks in there.
Mhm.
Okay. I call it the adventure with the Tuskegee Airmen.